So, all right, y'all. Well, good to see everyone. Diving into a second semester here. Today, we're going to look at Meanwhile Back East. We've kind of done a lot of things, but our minds in the Western Church tend to go towards the West. I mean, even though we're Protestants, even though we trace our lineage, to the Church of England, we also trace our lineage to the Roman Catholic Church in some ways. And so oftentimes we have this natural bias to lean towards the history of the Western Church. And even the book does that. Now, this is a history of world Christianity, and yet, oh, by the way, here's a couple chapters on Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay, and then there's another chapter or two, and we'll tackle those later on. So it's a natural bias we have. So today we are going to focus in on the Eastern side of things. And having said that, when we focus on the East, we often only focus on the Eastern Orthodox Church. There's certainly the big gorilla on the Eastern side of the East-West church divide, but there are some other churches. In fact, they're so far off our radar screen, even in seminary, I did not learn about the missionaries that went out from the Iraq area 1,400 years ago and went all the way to China, took Christianity to China in the Dark Ages. Even in seminary, they didn't teach us that. In fact, they found this church. They realized this old pagoda was actually a Christian church at one point, built in 781-ish. And so, that's a phenomenal history. It's really off our radar screen. So even when we talk about the Eastern Church, we often think about just the Eastern Orthodox Church and forget there were other Eastern churches. On this map here, the Eastern Orthodox Church is in purple, and that's certainly an important church here. But there are other churches. There's the Coptic Church. Then there were these Oriental Rite churches that are of ancient areas and even coexisted with Islam for a long while in what we would call Babylon, and even further in what we would call Iran or Persia. So we need to keep that in mind. And there are still some Christians that follow these branches of the Eastern rites of Christianity. In fact, the Coptic Church is still strong in Egypt and still strong in Ethiopia. We had a Coptic Christian in Plainview when I was teaching high school several decades ago, and they moved to Plainview. He was actually a wealthy landowner that got caught up in the revolution and had to head to the bottom of the pack and worked manual labor in Plainview, and was just the nicest guy you'd ever meet. So to be basically a plantation owner back in the old country and then be a common laborer in this country. But he was a wonderful Christian man, but he and his wife were Coptic, and the closest thing they could find in Plainview, Texas was the Episcopal Church. So it wasn't a very close fit, but you do what you have to do. So there are these other churches further east than just Eastern Orthodoxy. But having said that, our focus is mainly going to be on the Eastern Orthodox Church today. They are the big dog in the Eastern side of things. All right, just a little bit of review. We talked about the great schism between East and West in 1054, and we've also talked about the Viking invasions coming from the north. But for the Eastern Church, they didn't care much about the Vikings. The Muslim expansion really influenced the Eastern Church. We talked about that as well. We've looked at this graph before. The growth of Islam started, and it spreads over several centuries into these areas here. And then you've got the non-Islamic European Christian, European and Asian Christian kingdoms and this is before the Great Schism. And we looked at this before, but looking at the map of the Byzantine Empire, the effect of Islam really comes to play on this. The Byzantine Empire before Islam, all the way into southern Spain, along North Africa there. Then 500 years later, much smaller, and then it gets encroached on even more, moving up into Turkey. It does push back a little bit, but then right before its fall, it is really just a tiny remnant of its former glory. And to be fair, they're also being pressed by Christians up this way in the Baltic area. And so it's not just Islam pushing them this direction, they're also Christians pushing them the other way too. So the fall of Byzantium was not just because of Islam, but it certainly is squeezing the area of Eastern Orthodoxy. All right, couple things here. So one thing we need to remember when we think about Orthodoxy is that before 1054, before the Great Schism, Christianity may have been undivided, but it was not ever uniform. Christianity has never been uniform. You read St. Paul, and he's dealing with churches that have factions in them. Well, I was baptized by Apollos. I was baptized by Cephas. I was baptized by Paul. I didn't baptize any of you, except for you and you and you. But the rest of you, I didn't baptize. Anyway, so we already have these parties, these factions, and even in the very early church, 5 years in or less, maybe even 2 years in, you had the Greek-speaking Jewish people and the Aramaic-speaking Jewish people in the early church, and there's division there, and they have to appoint. Our widows are not being taken care of by the church, so let's appoint some Greek-speaking deacons. Anyway, there are always going to be divisions when you get any group of people together. There's going to be variety. But having said that, there was an overarching sense that we really are kind of one big, gigantic church. And the people that really pushed uniformity were the emperors, especially after the Roman Empire started converting to Christianity. Constantine and his successors. Constantine, if you remember, called some of the first councils because he wanted Christianity to be some glue that held his empire together. And he didn't like that bishops and Christians disagreed with each other. And so sort your stuff out. We want you to be the glue that holds us together politically, not a source of other divisions in our empire. So you're often getting a political push for uniformity, as well as an ecclesiastical desire to kind of get doctrine straight. Okay, we've dealt with some of those issues. But having said that, from the year 150 really until the year 1054, kind of the undivided church period, if you were really part of the one church, you would consider yourself both Catholic and Orthodox in the original sense of those words. We use these words as proper nouns now, but Catholic simply means universal. Katholikos, universal. It's a Greek word, the whole big enchilada, the whole shebang. And Orthodox has come to mean non-heretical, but literally it means right praise. We worship in the right way. Orthodoxy. We talk about a praise song being a doxology, same root word, doxy, praise. So orthodoxy, right praise, correct praise. So having said that, later on those terms began to, I'm missing a quotation mark, sorry, horror of horrors. Those terms started to become proper nouns later on and labels. But really, if you pressed any Christian, even today, even somebody in a very, very evangelical part of Christianity, most would say that they are part of the one church. Now, they might say that others of you are not part of the one church, but just about every Christian would claim to be Catholic in the sense of being part of the one church of Jesus Christ. Not use that label necessarily, but every Christian would consider themselves as part of Jesus's church. If they weren't, well, I'm not following the church of Jesus, I'm following the church of Bubba or what. Yeah, no Christian's going to make that kind of claim. At the same time, all Christians would probably make the claim that they are Orthodox, not using the term, but using the meaning behind it. My praise, my worship, my doctrine is correct. Yours may not be, but of course I'm right. So in a really real sense, all Christians are Orthodox, all Christians are Catholic, though we use those proper labels, proper nouns to apply to certain groups within the larger Christian church. And I've said this before, it's a good reminder to us, the Baptists are not the only people that baptize. The disciples of Christ are not the only followers of Christ. We use these terms, Presbyterians, presbyter, elder, or priest. Presbyterians are not the only ones with elders or priests. Episcopalians, we're not the only church with bishops, though that's what our name means. And again, Catholics are not the only part of the one church, and the Orthodox are not the only church that believes correctly in Jesus Christ. Now, they would probably say they believe more correctly than anybody else, okay. So, proper nouns. All right. And again, the Eastern Orthodox Church is different from those other Oriental Orthodox churches that are further out to the east. And they're also different from something called Eastern Rite Catholics. If you ever see a group in the Vatican, you see a bunch of cardinals, for example, and most of them have the little red beanies on, but occasionally you see a guy with some kind of weird black hat that kind of puffs up the top. What those are churches within the Roman Catholic Church that worship with worship patterns that are basically Orthodox, but they're within the Roman Catholic fold. So those are called Eastern Rite Catholics. Our seminary professor had an Eastern Rite priest. He's actually a bi-rite priest. He was Eastern and Western priest. He had him come and talk to our liturgics class once, and the guy was talking about weird things that, he's Roman Catholic either way, but when he's in Eastern mode, puts on the Eastern vestments, does a baptism, then he would confirm the kid right away, because that's what Eastern Christians do. If he's in his Western mode, in a Western congregation, he has to wait till a bishop comes and confirms people later on, many years later. So there are Eastern Rite Catholics, part of the Roman Catholic Church. That's not, yes, Trey.
In the last several years, hasn't the Roman Church invited Anglicans to join and become?
There are some Anglican Rite. There are also Anglican Rite Orthodox too. We had a priest in Wichita that became a Western Rite Orthodox priest, and had a small congregation in the Greek Cathedral there, the Greek Orthodox Cathedral. So yeah, there are some. Yeah, Bob.
What those things? There's a line in one of the chapters that said the Eastern and Western churches couldn't understand each other because they couldn't understand each other, speaking different languages. I know the Russian Orthodox Church, first I would say, is that other than whatever it is that caused the schism recently, is there any significant difference between Russian Orthodox and what we call Eastern Orthodox other than the language?
Hold that question. Yeah, there's some political, as far as the overarching worship and all, not really, but some political and cultural, there are some little things. Jimmy's our expert in Orthodoxy here, so he'll keep us honest. But really politically and culturally a little more. And we'll talk more about the Russian Orthodox in just a minute here. But that's a good point, Bob. Part of the schism is because the Western Church thought and spoke Latin and thought in Latin terms, and the Eastern Church thought and spoke in Greek. And the thinking in Greek was actually more important than the speaking in Greek. They talked past each other in a lot of ways, and especially over the Trinity and stuff. You say one word, and when we try to translate it, it doesn't work well in translation. And all of a sudden we have three gods. It sounds like you have three gods on the other side of the fence. No. You just don't understand. It's one God, of course. It doesn't sound that way when you translate it. So, all right. So the Eastern Orthodox today are those who are in communion with the Patriarch of Constantinople, in theory, with the interesting exception of the Russians. We'll talk more about the Russians in a minute. But after 1589, for some, the Patriarch of Moscow would be added to the list of the big four that were there at the Great Schism in 1054. The Russians were latecomers to Orthodoxy. We'll talk more about that in just a second as well. But that's not universally accepted in Orthodoxy. You get on Wikipedia today, if you're on a Russian Orthodox site, of course our guy is equal to these guys. You get on Greek Orthodox site, and they'll talk about the original four, and then the lesser patriarchs, one level down, like the guy in Moscow. He's not quite equal to the Patriarch of Constantinople. So there is some intra-Orthodox political tension right now, and one of the reasons we have an Orthodox church meeting upstairs is because the Russians and the Greeks are not playing well with each other right now. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later here. All right, but you sometimes will hear the term Greek Orthodox, and we think of that as just the Patriarch of Constantinople and his churches, especially after the fall of Byzantium in 1453. But that term is also used for those in the other great patriarchies, Alexandria and Jerusalem and Antioch. So sometimes Eastern Orthodox just applies to this bunch, but often Eastern Orthodox applies, or Greek Orthodox applies to this bunch. The term is a little bit loose there, so don't be confused if you ever hear that. All right, just by the way, you often see that symbol for Eastern Orthodoxy, and that's a little confusing to Western Christians. Why do they have extra crosses on top of the crosses and all? What's up with that? What it really is this is just the title on the cross, and this is the footrest. So it's still a cross. It's just a more elaborate form of a cross with extra pieces parts. It's not 2 or 3 crosses put together. It's still one cross, but you often will see that as a symbol for Eastern Orthodoxy. And sometimes the footrest is slanted, and sometimes it's straight. It kind of sometimes depends on which Orthodox group you're talking about. But if you ever see that symbol and wonder, well, that's a weird cross. Well, it's just not that.
Jim, I don't want to go chase a rabbit, but
Sure.
I've always wondered, when Jesus was hung on the cross, how did they attach his feet? And was there a footrest, or I was just something on the internet where they discovered that possibly were put them in their ankles to the side, which makes more sense to me.
One of the things we don't know is how Jesus was crucified. The Romans apparently crucified in many, many different ways, and sometimes it depended on how bored the Roman soldiers were. Peter was crucified upside down. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross, according to tradition. They would not only sometimes they give it depends if they're in a hurry. If they're hanging you mainly from your arms, you're going to die faster. If they want you to last a little longer, footrest was sometimes done. A rear end rest was sometimes on the cross, and sometimes it was a board. Sometimes it was a peg, which that would not be much support, but it prolonged your agony. This is kind of the mood of the Roman soldiers in some ways. Also, oftentimes it was just a post, and they would just lock a cross beam. So crosses were often T-shaped and not cross-shaped, and so just kind of depended in some ways on how much wood was available, what the local. Oftentimes they'd leave the upright posts in areas for public execution and bring the crossbars along. So we really don't know. But what you're referring to, Gordon, they have dug up skeletons in Israel with ankle bones with nails going in like this, looking like you're on the cross this way and being nailed directly through the ankle into the wood.
Which would seem like it'd be more painful, because to support yourself, you'd have to push down.
Right. And that's what eventually gets you is the exhaustion from trying to support yourself, and eventually you give up and your diaphragm collapses, and it's not a good way to go. But crucifixion, Jesus was a rare crucifixion. 3 hours was a very quick death. 3 days was not uncommon, or longer. Oftentimes they keep you going until you died from exposure, starvation, whatever, thirst. So, which is why they broke the legs to hasten the other 2 guys crucified with Jesus. Sure. All right. Now, one thing about Orthodox Christianity is if you ask them, they would claim to be the closest thing to pure Christianity. I mean, most of us think we're the closest thing to pure Christianity anyway, but they would say that we haven't changed in centuries, millennia. We have kept the exact same faith that was given to us. You other Christians keep making these innovations, but we have kept the pure faith all this time. Now, they have made some tweaks and changes if you really press them, small ones, but they do really view themselves as having the unbroken broken chain. In fact, Jimmy found this Orthodox graphic, which is fascinating. They say this is their graph. They have not changed. They are They are keeping along in exactly the same deposit of Christianity. Hang on a second, Trey. What's fascinating on this one is they say the Roman Catholic Church branched off and kept getting different, worse and worse and worse. And then these Protestants broke off, and they were even more away from the line of solid things. But what's fascinating to me is notice this line. Of all the heretics, the least heretical group that has changed the least is the Anglican Communion, our tradition. The Orthodox oftentimes get along fairly decently with us. Sometimes if there's no Orthodox church, our priest says, well, go see the Anglicans, go see the Episcopalians in your local town. Part of that is that at the Reformation, we added some things back in the liturgy that the Roman Church had dropped. And even in 1789, when the American prayer book was split off from the English prayer book, we added some things back in the Orthodox had that the English Church had not adopted. So in some ways, there is some real truth to that. Trey, go ahead.
As far as keeping things the way they originally were, how did they move from eating bread and drinking wine to putting the bread in the wine and eating it with a spoon?
That's because people started taking the bread home for magical purposes, and the priest said, we're not doing this. I'm going to give it to you directly in your mouth, and I'm going to see you eat it, and you're not going to take this home.
And the Western Church had concerns about that too. That's one of the reasons the Western Church will plate under you, and they put the wafer on your tongue and make sure you're not going to spit it back out and take it home and use it for witchcraft or something. But yeah, the Orthodox answer was we'll just make it a slurry and give you the slurry, bread and wine together. So. Yeah, I mean, so there are innovations. Yeah.
I've actually seen one of these, but it's like the Church of Christ. So
Okay, all right.
Kind of like Baptists or something.
Well, yeah, everybody wants to believe that they are the. And the funny thing in our tradition is we value being the middle way. And I've talked to extremely conservative Episcopalians, and they say, "Oh, we're right in the middle." And I've talked to these radical leftist Episcopalians. Oh, we're right in the middle. We have a desire the other way. We want to be the center, even if it's not realistic. You're on the left wing fringe. You won't say the Lord's Prayer because it says Father, but you're in the middle. Okay, all right, great.
When I was a freshman at Tech, I got into a pamphlet by the Church of Christ people that had this map. Church of Christ people went straight to heaven. Other Protestants could get to heaven through the Church of Christ. The Roman Catholics went straight to heaven.
Wow.
And what's fascinating recently, there was a lot of anti-Catholic bias in Protestantism, and that not just from Baptists, but mainline Protestants too. In our country, we've got a history of that. What's interesting is the abortion debates in the past 40 years, since the evangelical Protestants and the Roman Catholics have kind of kept a hard line on one end of that debate, that has made the Catholics a lot more acceptable in a lot of evangelical circles, which is a fascinating development, but we digress a little bit. All right. One of the things we've mentioned this before, but a reminder, because Orthodoxy has multiple centers of authority, when the split happened, there was one patriarch on the western side of the fence, and that was the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Because there are multiple centers of authority in Orthodoxy, that has meant that they're less top down in a way. They're still pretty hierarchical. The priest calls the shots in a lot of ways, in a lot of congregations. I think the bishops are important and all that. But when it comes to the whole shebang, the whole enchilada, because we've got several patriarchs, several top guys, we need to meet together. We need to agree. They need to meet together. They need to agree. We need to have something more conciliar than just a top down with an apex. So it's not a pyramid that goes up to a point. It's a pyramid that goes up to a broad chunk at the top. If that makes some sense. All right. Let's talk a little bit about Eastern Orthodox liturgies, because those are pretty ancient. If a church uses the name Right Praise, you assume that liturgy and worship is very important to it, and it's extremely important to the Orthodox Church. They use basically Eucharistic prayers that are 1,500 plus years old and really haven't monkeyed with them much since then. The most common liturgy is the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. I'll talk about him in a second. And they have a special liturgy called the Liturgy of St. Basil. We've dealt with Basil several times, talking about monasticism, talking about Trinitarian theology. Basil, they call him Basil the Great for a reason. He had his finger in a lot of pies in the Eastern Church. But the Liturgy of St. Basil even appears in an abbreviated form in our prayer book. During Easter, we use Eucharistic Prayer D, which is an ecumenical translation and condensation, extreme condensation of the Liturgy of St. Basil. So during Easter, for the sake of being as ecumenical as we can, because that's the greatest season of the church year, I like to use Prayer D. And so when Easter comes along, that's an Orthodox prayer. That's the oldest prayer we have in the prayer book as far as Eucharist go. So when we do the these and thous at 8 o'clock, that's stuff from the 1500s. So this is stuff from the 500s during Easter, much older. And it's very poetic. You may not be able to read it this, but just to remind you, it's truly right to glorify you, Father, and to give you thanks, for you alone are God, living and true, dwelling in light, inaccessible from before time and forever. And what wonderful poetic language. Fountain of life and source of all goodness, you made all things and filled them with your blessing. You created them to rejoice in the splendor of your radiance. Countless throngs of angels stand before you to serve you night and day. And beholding the glory of your presence, they offer you unceasing praise. Joining with them and giving voice to every creature under heaven, we acclaim you and glorify your name as we sing or say, holy, holy, holy. So it's just a very poetic flavor of liturgy that the Orthodox Christians have. And they do a lot of chanting. In fact, if you really can't carry a tune, you really don't need to be a priest in the Orthodox Church. And now you don't have to be a great singer, but you have to at least be marginally competent. My dad could not be an Orthodox priest. He's completely tone deaf and can't find two notes to save his life. But thank God I got mom's voice and not dad's voice. But so Orthodox priests do chant a lot. St. John Chrysostom, I don't think we've mentioned him yet. John is another hugely important saint, renowned East and West. He was the Archbishop of Constantinople around 400 AD. And Chrysostom was actually his nickname. It just means the golden tongued or the golden mouthed. He gave such beautiful sermons, golden tongue. Nobody's called me Jim Chrysostom, Jim the golden tongued. So something to aspire to. But he also was an important theologian. And we still have one of the prayers from his liturgy in morning prayer. If you pray morning prayer, Almighty God, you've given us grace at this time with one accord to make our common supplication to you. And you've promised to your well-beloved Son that when 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, you'll be in the midst of them. Well, now fulfill, O Lord, our desires and petitions as may be best for us, granting us in this world knowledge of your truth, and in the age to come life everlasting. Beautiful prayer. And part of, I don't know if that was in any Roman rite, but is that an addition in the, and it's an old Cranmer edition. That's one of those Orthodox things that was brought in at the Reformation. So
where did they get this stuff?
from Orthodox
But I mean,
liturgies.
There were
Printing presses were a big thing right before the Reformation. We'll get to that.
there were a couple of liturgies holding over from like Theodore of Tarsus too that I think brought some stuff over.
And there was some travel and some intermixing, and so and Cranmer was interested in it too, to study these liturgies. And so things, you weren't in the Dark Ages here. You were in the little post-Renaissance in some areas. There's a rebirth, there's a rediscovery, there's some interaction between East and West again. So,
and then so over here at St. Catherine and then over at St. Andrew.
St. Catherine, St. Andrew, yeah.
What language do they use in their liturgy?
It's mostly English, but at St. Catherine, Russian is used a little bit, and at St. Andrew, Greek is used a bit more because it's Greek and Russian. But at St. Andrews, they'll sometimes, because it's a fairly multi-ethnic group, they'll sometimes do other stuff, especially at Easter
time when they read every language they have
they read
facility
every
in,
language, and the priest will literally give us the special Easter greeting in just about every language that there's somebody there.
So Father Alexander, the priest at St. Catherine's, which is the Russian church upstairs, he's Romanian by birth, and upbringing, but grew up mostly in Spain. So he came to this country. He still got an immigrant visa, but he came to this country fluent in Spanish, but hardly speaking any English. So he could speak Russian really well and Romanian and Spanish. Jimmy says he's fluent in completely, which I'll trust Jimmy on. But English, he's worked hard and he's gotten much better in the past year or 15 months or whatever he's been here now. So,
During COVID, when I would come and sit in the office
Mhm.
for Sunday school, I mean, they'd walk by, I'd see them walk by.
Yeah.
One day, some man walked by the door, looked at it and said, "Good morning." And I said to him in Russian, "Доброе утро," which is good morning. And he goes, "I don't speak Russian." I don't know who he was.
okay, well,
He knows Russian.
Russian Orthodox, but maybe not Russian fluent.
Yeah, and the Russian Orthodox really is like all of the stuff all the countries that are. around.
Ukrainian
Yeah.
and Belarus and Georgia. And, yeah, good luck there. Okay, historically, one thing I wanted to talk about real quickly, one historical thing that was big in Orthodoxy that wasn't such a big deal in the West, but huge for them, was the controversy known as Iconoclasm. It was really more than a century of controversy. It happened kind of right towards the beginning of Islam, a century or so after Islam was founded. But as Islam was starting to buck up against Eastern Orthodoxy, Islam takes a very hard line against not portraying God. If you go into an Islamic mosque, or you go to Spain and see some of those beautiful buildings, I've seen pictures, Jimmy's seen the real thing. They have very abstract artwork. You never picture God, you never picture much of anything. Calligraphy and abstract designs are the name of the game. And so one of the accusations was, as they bumped up against Orthodoxy, is y'all are a bunch of idolaters. We look at your churches, they've got all these paintings and a few statues, mainly icons. And so you're idolaters. And some of the Orthodox said, maybe we need to clean that up. And maybe we need to stop doing all these wonderful icons and pictures. And so there was this iconoclasm controversy, whether we should eliminate icons from worship because they're idolatrous. So just for example, two churches in Constantinople, one built in the 300s or 400s here, lots of icons. A church built during the iconoclastic controversy, same city. That's the way their dome looked, just a simple cross. Very unusual. You don't see Orthodox churches that look like that, which means the iconoclastic period didn't last. They came out of it with a different decision, but you got to get rid of all this idolatrous stuff. And the reason they were able to come out of it, John of Damascus was a theologian, and he put forward some arguments that took and got agreement eventually from just about everybody. He said, most importantly, if God's a human being, if God chose to become a human being in Jesus Christ, yes, we can't picture who God is because God is an ineffable spirit and all that. But if he became a human being, then all bets are off because human beings have faces and they have bodies. And so it's okay to depict that. If God chose to become a human, then it's okay to depict the humanity of Jesus. Interesting argument. Other thing he said, we need to draw a distinction, a couple other things he said, that images, when you look at an image, this is just an imitation. This is not the real deal. If you see a picture of Jesus, that's not Jesus in the icon, that's a depiction of him. And so he made a distinction that they share the substance, they don't share the substance of what they depict. They're just simply depicting it. So if you see Jesus in the picture, that's not really Jesus there. That's just an image, a reminder, a window. You get that for a second. So they're pointing you towards something, towards the reality behind what the picture is, but you're not worshiping the picture itself as an image. So it's not idolatry in that sense. And he's also the idea of icons being images or windows that you look through to see what's behind, see the reality behind. So you're not worshiping the icon, you're worshiping Christ or God behind the icon. Jimmy, you want to say something? You're chomping at the bit.
A lot of times Orthodox, when they come into churches, they kiss icons too, and it's not to give reverence to the icon itself, but it's to pay reverence to what the icon's depicting, the saint or the.
And we some Episcopalians bow when the cross goes by. or make the sign of the cross. That's not to worship that piece of metal that's shaped in the sign of the cross. Somebody once said, I forget who, you take two sticks, you put them together, you bow to it. You take two sticks and pull them apart, it's nothing. It's what that symbol points to that's important. It's not the objects themselves. You take them apart, they're just wood or metal or whatever. Yeah, Trey.
Emily's boyfriend, when she was in high school, would come to church sometimes.
Uh-huh.
And I noticed he would bow if he crossed the aisle,
Uh-huh.
imitating Roseanne. And he asked Roseanne, why is she doing that? She said, well, you bow to the cross. And I told her, you actually not. Said, you're bowing toward the altar because the consecrated bread and wine
Right.
is up there, not because the cross is there.
And if you really want to get picky, you've got the bread and wine. The altar is made holy because the bread and wine, is there. But we also keep the bread and wine in that little ombre on the side too. So yeah. We've got several loci of reverence. Orthodox have lots of icons. I'll show you a picture of upstairs in a minute here, but all kinds of depictions of Jesus and other things as well, other saints. But one thing you may not notice, this is, train tracks perspective. You're used to Western art. You probably did this in elementary school, and you draw train tracks and or a road, they go off in the distance and go to a vanishing point. Renaissance art was all about perspective and vanishing points. The Orthodox don't have a vanishing point like that in their icons. This is a Russian thing I found on the internet. You got Russian letters down there, but it's actually reverse perspective. You look carefully at an icon, things don't get smaller in the distance. Things get bigger in the distance. So a chair and an icon will actually get, the vanishing point is actually you. It's reverse perspective. It gets narrower as it goes towards you, and it gets bigger as you go towards the heavenly realm. So these are windows in a way. They open you up to the greater reality. It's not that the reality is distant and goes to nothing else. No, it opens and widens. And so if you look at this reverse perspective is subtle sometimes, but this table here is coming towards you. It's not vanishing in the distance like a Western painting would. And even their stools and their chairs and things. Same thing there. Look at the platform Mary's on. It converges towards you and opens up behind them. Same thing with this cross. If you really measure these angles carefully, it's coming towards you. There's a vanishing point. It's you, and it widens. The cross widens as it goes. So it's a reverse perspective they use, which is a fascinating thing to open you up to a different reality. Okay, there's John Damascus. By the way, John Damascus, we have some of his hymns in the hymnal, just a few of them. My favorite is "Come Ye Faithful, Raise the Strain of Triumphant Gladness." We sing it at Easter. God hath brought his Israel out of joy from sadness, loose from Pharaoh's bitter yoke. It's in English, and it's a tune. I think it may be, Arthur Sullivan, as in Gilbert and wrote the tune. So it's a very Western tune later, but a translation of his hymn. Another translation of an Orthodox hymn that we use a lot: "Let all mortal flesh keep silent." During Christmas and Epiphany, we still sing the second verse as a fraction of the late service. "King of kings, yet born of Mary, as of old on earth he stood." Ancient Orthodox hymn. All right, the Eastern Orthodox Church pushed from the Greek areas into the Slavic areas. The two guys that are responsible for that were named Saint Cyril and Methodius. They are regarded as the apostles to the Slavs. So first, Orthodoxy spread that direction. Then Orthodoxy spread eventually to Russia. How did it get to Russia? Well, there's a story. The story may or may not be exactly true, but here's how the story goes. Vladimir was the Prince of Kiev. Vladimir wanted his country to pick a religion, and he wanted his people to have some kind of faith. He didn't really care what, but he wanted the best one. So he sent envoys to all the neighboring areas. Sent envoys to Germany to see what the Catholics were doing, and down to Byzantium to see what the Orthodox. He sent envoys to Muslim areas. And as the story goes, he got the report. All these envoys came back and went, not too impressive. But the guys that came back from Constantinople said, "We didn't know if we were on earth or in heaven. The worship was so beautiful; it was astounding." And so eventually, Vladimir married a Byzantine princess, and he and his nation converted to orthodoxy. Back then, the prince converts, then the nation goes along with them. And so that's the story behind Russian Orthodoxy. Whether that's true or more legendary, there's debate, but okay. What we do know, as time went on, as Constantinople was pushed by Islam, the more they got squeezed, the more important the church up in Russia became, because it was kind of high and dry and above all this tension. Eventually, when Constantinople fell, the Patriarch of Moscow said, well, we really are the third Rome now. There was the first Rome in Italy, then there was the second Rome in Constantinople. Now Moscow is the third Rome. Again, not every Orthodox Christian would go along with that, especially the non-Russians, but and then a century and a half later, roughly, they claim that they are of equal standing, that the Patriarch of Moscow is of equal standing. And again, that is disputed. All right, well, if you go into an Orthodox church, they'll usually have lots of icons. I had the second biggest collection of icons. I have the second biggest collection of icons in my office now. It used to be the biggest grouping of icons in this building until the Orthodox came, and then they filled up their chapel with tons of icons. So, but a typical Orthodox church often will have a dome, but the important thing is between the altar and the people usually stand for worship. Modern churches do have pews, but you don't sit much unless you're old or infirm. Or, they usually have a screen though in between, and there are 3 doors in the screen, middle and 2 side doors. But this is, and it's got certain icons on it. It's called an iconostasis or iconostasis. So this is one of the striking things you often see. You don't see the altar easily in most Orthodox churches because of this iconostasis. So if you go upstairs to our old children's chapel, they've got lots of icons on the wall, and they have built a little iconostasis. 3 doors, now 2 of them are curtains, but they have some little wooden doors here, and the altar is behind that. And a little chair for the priest to sit at certain times, but they've taken most of the other chairs out. They got a couple chairs along the edge for those who are old and can't stand. And by the way, Father Alexander is not married. He is a monk. And that is one of the interesting things about Orthodox Christians. If you're a priest, you don't have to be celibate. You can be, and if you are, you're usually going to be a monk. But you can be married if you're ordained, but you can't remarry. So if your wife dies, then you need to be celibate the rest of your life. So a little bit different from the Western Roman Catholic type of thing. But if you're going to be a bishop, you have to be a celibate monk. So they do make a distinction there. Yeah, Bob.
How do you know what happens when, for instance, when an Episcopal priest becomes a Catholic priest? If they're already married, they can stay married. If they become unmarried for some reason.
And Orthodox, the Catholics, the Episcopalians that go to the Orthodox Church as well, that's usually the rule as well. So yes. So like Father Steve, who used to be here, became a Roman Catholic priest, and Dixie is his wife. But if Dixie dies, Steve can't remarry at that point. So, all right. But Orthodox churches come in a wide variety. So this is the Cathedral in Wichita. Jimmy and I would visit that on occasion. It's a beautiful Orthodox church for out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. Well, Wichita's a city, 350,000, not nowhere, but it's pretty impressive church for out in mid-America like that. In Chicago, I visited a couple Orthodox churches. This one is in a Russian neighborhood in Chicago. I felt so sad. I got there early because the service started at 10. I didn't realize that the beginning part of the service started at 10. The real service started at 10:30. And I got there and the place was quarter full at most. Big building, quarter full. And I thought, what a dang shame. This ancient, beautiful tradition of faith, and place is a quarter full. By the time the gospel was read, every pew was full of people standing because they don't sit. And there were people standing along the walls and along the aisles and in the back, and the place was packed to the gills. They just don't all show up for the beginning of the service. You got to be there by the time the gospel is read, and by the time the gospel was read, the place was packed. So beautiful, very traditional. This is their iconostasis, very ornate. Also, though, I visited another Orthodox church that was near our seminary in one of the suburbs, northwestern suburbs. extremely modern. Here's their iconostasis, their iconostasis. It was just 4 big icons, and they had a little gate, but you could see right over the thing, right through the thing, and see the altar there. So not typical for an Orthodox church, but they were a real, honest to goodness, Orthodox church with a very modern look. The vestments, nothing modern about those. It's still ancient Orthodox worship, though the architecture much more modern. So fascinating. There are some variations in Orthodoxy, but fascinating.
Do they use a
Yeah.
monstrance?
No,
The Romans?
no. Yeah, no, they don't do monsters. They don't, for the communion bread is eaten, they reserve some of it for second communion, but they don't do anything.
One cool thing, they do practice closed communion, so Episcopalians don't receive communion there like we don't in Catholic churches if we admit to being Episcopalians. But one thing they do at the end of the service, they give bread of fellowship. It's not Eucharist, but you get a chunk of bread to take home for your Sunday dinner or to eat then or whatever you want to do. So there is a second thing of bread. It's also very complicated. Jimmy can tell you all about this later. The priest has to start really early. We have these little wafers and things that are already pre-pressed and pre-stamped. They take a loaf of bread and they've got to start slicing up with basically a liturgical scalpel. They take off 12 little pieces to represent 12 apostles they don't use. They carve out certain parts of it that they'll use for Eucharist, and other parts of it are used for other things, which is a fascinating thing. But
Is it 11th loaf?
it is
yeah.
leavened, yeah.
And
Yeah.
actually 2 sections because of the 2 natures of Christ. It's,
A lot of work,
Yeah.
So the priest has to start early. That's what I got there for that part of the service. The priest is doing these prayers and these slicings and all that. And no Orthodox people were there hardly, except little old ladies that were really faithful and gung ho that were there early. But yeah, Traeger.
This is just a story. I grew up in El Paso, ran around with a bunch of kids. One of them was Jewish. Her family owned a jewelry store downtown El Paso. They sold crucifixes and medallions and stuff. A lot of their clientele were Catholic. One of their employees was an orphan. When she got engaged, she asked her Jewish employers to stand in as her parents at her wedding. Got married at St. Patrick's Cathedral. And they told the priest during the rehearsal, don't give us the bread because we're Jewish. He forgot.
Oh,
He gave them the bread and they ate it. And they said they went to their rabbi and told him what happened and said, Rabbi, what do we do? The rabbi said, say 3 Hail Marys and forget about it.
that's funny. That's funny. Well, very good. Well, next 2 weeks, we'll go back to the western side of the divide, and we'll look at especially the 13 and 1400s, the late Middle Ages, and there's some tough things going on during that time, some unrest and difficulties that lead up to Reformation. We'll get to the Reformation in February, but that's the game plan moving forward here. If you have further questions about Orthodoxy, Jimmy is our resident expert on that. And if not, Father Alexander. The Greek priest was here. They had a small service for St. Catherine's Day. This is right before Christmas, our Christmas. And so the Greek priest was here too. He and Father Alexander communicate. They talk to each other. It's just their bishops, their patriarchs, they're out of communion with each other. Orthodox clergy talk about the flat tops. The bishops have flat hats. And so the flat tops causes problems sometimes. The guys up at the top of the pyramid causes problems. For a church in Lubbock that's not very big, that gets maybe 30 people, to have to split in 1/3, 2/3 because of orders from Moscow or disagreements between Moscow and Constantinople, that's a tough thing. But the Russian Orthodox Christians here feel they have to be obedient, and so that's why they've come over. And I thought they'd be only here for a little while, that they may be here. Yeah. It's been a couple of years. They say it sometimes takes decades or centuries to sort these things out. These things will get sorted out eventually, but their timetable is pretty slow. So they're not anticipating it to happen in weeks or months.
a quick answer in the Eastern Orthodoxy, quick changes at least several decades, if not.
Quick changes, decades, not centuries, so. Well, very good, y'all. Any final questions here? We're a little bit long, but
Prior to
Hey, Mark.
the 900s, what you talked about the Prince, the Russian.
Prince Vladimir, yes.
Yeah. was it just a variety of like pagan religions?
Yeah,
mostly?
yeah. I mean, the Germans were pagan and they had Boniface and stuff go in there in what, 400s, 500s. The Slavs were kind of paganish and, Cyril and Methodius. So that's what Christianity is pressing up against, pagan. And up there, probably something more like Norse stuff, or maybe some, Wiccan type, magical nature god, nature stuff. I'm not sure what Russian stuff looked like beforehand.
Like the Chernobyl, there's a Slavic mythology.
Okay, Slavic. Okay, all right.
What time do they meet?
I think it's around the 10:30, like 10 for the main service, but the priest has to come in and do everything before.
Yeah.
So he starts at like 9.
He starts early, and they also have to observe all the holy days and things. So they're up here for the major holy days that they have on their calendar. Yeah, and you're welcome. You're always welcome to go to Orthodox service. So. And if you're a visitor, they might even let you sit down.
When I was in high school, went to the Russian Orthodox, or Russian studies class. Went to the Orthodox Church for Easter, which is particularly like
Yes.
and particularly in since late. And they let us sit in the balcony. They let the, I guess the non-Russian version of Goyim sit in the balcony, and one of the guys stood for a long time. One of the kids in our class passed out. He was standing up for so long.
Yeah, it's long. I mean, Jimmy and I went to a Good Friday service. Easter is a different date, so it was just a Friday to us, a Friday during our Easter season. But went to their Good Friday service, and about halfway through, everybody left. I thought it was over. It was just not even halfway. They marched around the church, following a banner of the dead Christ. And then one of the coolest things ever is everybody goes back in the church underneath the banner of the dead Christ. You enter the church through the death of Jesus Christ. And it's a very visceral reminder of that. Then they bury that banner, and then it's gone on Easter. It disappears. How about that? He's risen. So anyway, if you go to Orthodox service on a special day, be prepared for special liturgy. Okay, y'all, we'll draw to a close there and pick up with the late Middle Ages next week.
The liturgy, either Russian or Greek.
Mostly English. Sure. A little Spanish, Russian, Greek.